No, but I was thinking, I really think.
Okay, should I go ahead and get started today? Before we do start, I just want to note that the seminar is being recorded for the supervisory team, but it will not be available on the SMP YouTube page later on following the seminar. Please do feel free to turn off the camera if you prefer not to be seen. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I'd like to also acknowledge the significant contribution that they have made, caring for the land, sharing their knowledge and their culture with all of us. I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples joining us today in person and online, and to the traditional custodians of the lands from which our online attendees are joining. I want to also acknowledge that the sovereignty of this land was never ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. A quick reminder again that our HDR student reps will be meeting today for their fortnightly writing group from 1 to 4 p.m. in room 2.36 of the Flory building. So if you're an HDR student, please feel free to join them. Today, we're really excited to welcome Melanie Thomas. Melanie is currently a PhD student in the School of Medicine and Psychology, studying the social foundations of medicine. She's currently finishing her PhD part-time while also working in clinical practice as a GP obstetrician in Northeast Arnhem. We're very thrilled to have Melanie here to present her exit seminar titled Falls, Babies and Bullying, Barriers to Career Progression for Women in the Australian Obstetrics and Gynecological Profession. Thanks, Melanie, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming along. My name is Melanie Thomas and today I'm presenting to you my PhD research entitled Balls, Babies and Bullying, which explores the barriers to career progression for women in the profession of obstetrics and gynaecology in Australia. I'd like to first acknowledge the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet today and pay respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I'm from Yulngu country in East Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory, where I've been living, working and writing this thesis for the last number of years. So I'd like to start off with some terms, just so that some of you who won't be familiar with the profession will understand what I'm talking about as I go along. So O&G is obstetrics and gynaecology, which is a specialty of medicine. RANZCOG is the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Obstetrics and Gynaecology. It's responsible for training all O&G doctors in Australia and New Zealand. And if you're interested in the profession, you don't have any other choice but to train through RANZCOG. And the mission of RANZCOG is to continue to lead in education and training in obstetrics and gynaecology and advocacy in women's health. A registrar is a doctor who is training towards specialty training. So for the purposes of this presentation, the registrars are trainee obstetrics and gynaecology doctors, and a consultant is a doctor who's completed their O&G training already. The training pathway from high school, if you finish high school and go straight into medicine, generally, you'll be finished medical school by about age 24. There's different pathways to do that. Some people do it as postgraduates and are much older by the time they finish medical school. Then there's an intern and residency, which is at least 2 years. So you'll be age 26. O&G training is full-time, 6 years. And so the minimum time to complete your training is by age 32. But in reality, most people are older than that when they finish training for various reasons. And then you're a consultant once you finish your training until you retire. So background, O&G is a field of medicine which deals almost exclusively with female patients, and the trainee cohort consists 80% female trainees. O&G is unique in the field of medicine as it has the largest proportion of women in training compared to other medical specialties. However, it has a long history of male domination. Despite the fact that women form the vast majority of trainees and have been in the majority for at least the last 2 decades, women are disproportionately underrepresented in positions of leadership within O&G departments and peak bodies. And this is a concern that RANZCOG itself acknowledges. In their Gender and Equity and Diversity report from 2019, they state RANZCOG has the highest percentage of female members in comparison to other Australian and New Zealand medical colleges, yet one of the lowest percentages of women in top level leadership. This is also an issue for other Western nations in the field of O&G. The aim of this thesis is to explore the systemic, cultural and personal factors which affect the career trajectory of female medical practitioners working in obstetrics and gynaecology in Australia. My background, so from the beginning I always wanted to go into obstetrics and gynaecology before I started medicine. I had 4 children of my own prior to commencing medical school and had been involved in working and socialising with women throughout my whole adult life. And so this topic is both intellectually and personally of interest to me. I managed to get onto O&G training quickly, but I was allocated a hospital which was in a different state to where my family was living, and having kids in high school and well settled, I didn't want to move them. So in my enthusiasm to work in the field, I took a position and moved interstate, commuting as often as possible back to my family. This was unsustainable, and after 2 years, I was looking for a way to live with my family again, but not having to quit O&G training. And the one way that I found that I could take off time was to do a PhD. So I've chosen to do this PhD. And the topic that I chose to research was the barriers to career progression for women in obstetrics and gynaecology. I now work in Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory as a GP obstetrician, and I've been living in the NT for the past 6 years and working full-time and completing this thesis for what feels like hundreds of years, but actually 6 or 7 years. So the rationale for the project, it's well summarised by Linda Brubacher, who stated in her 2022 article, obstetrics and gynaecology, which is largely for and comprises women, should be an unsurpassed example of gender equity. There's significant opportunity cost associated with women not reaching the same leadership potential as men. Given that both patient and trainee base are overwhelmingly women, the stakes of inadequate representation of women in RANZCOG leadership is likely higher than in other organisations and medical colleges. Due to institutional structures and cultural factors, RANZCOG presents barriers limiting leadership opportunities for women. These barriers are multifactorial, including the position of women in society, women's role as mother, as well as organisational and structural barriers within the hospital and training systems. My study is uniquely positioned to explore the specific experiences of female practitioners throughout the methodological framework that I have used, which I'll now discuss. This is a qualitative research project with theoretical underpinnings in social constructionism and feminism. Social constructionism is a framework that proposes that knowledge is socially constructed rather than objective, stable, or true. It examines a phenomenon from the perspective of the society in which it exists. The purpose of the feminist lens is to enable the discovery of how people interact with systems and possibly offer solutions to confront and eradicate oppressive systems and structures. Feminist theory considers the lived experience of people, not just women, with an emphasis on oppression. Recruitment was through an O&G doctor group on Facebook, as well as word of mouth. I used purposive sampling so that I could recruit participants who would be most able to give in-depth data around the topic, and I recruited medical doctors who worked in the field of O&G. I used semi-structured interviews for my data collection in order to gain an in-depth perspective and understanding of the experiences of individuals working within the field. The semi-structured interview allows for the participant to guide the narrative and story that is shared, and this has the capacity for discovering new meanings beyond what is driven by myself as the interviewer. My analytical approach was thematic analysis as per Braun and Clark, which is a qualitative interpretivist approach to understanding the social world through narrative. Thematic analysis involves identifying themes within the whole data set and then interpreting them to answer the research question. As a qualitative project, it is important for me to consider my positionality. In this research, my position as a doctor in the field of O&G means that I would have been a possible participant in my own research, giving me a unique understanding of the cultural issues at play. It also meant that during interviews, participants were able to speak to me as a colleague and someone who understood the field. This personal closeness to the field also meant that I had to actively engage in reflexive analytical process to use my personal experiences to help me to understand the context, but to make sure that participants' experiences were privileged and not my own. The participants' details are confidential, and I've used pseudonyms rather than real names. So that the participants, I interviewed 35 medical doctors, 32 of which were women and 3 were men. All of the men had multiple children, between 4 and 5 each. Of the male participants, I had 2 junior consultants, less than 10 years in the field, and 1 senior consultant who'd spent more than 2 decades in the field. Of the female participants, I interviewed 5 that had quit the field, 5 who were registrars, 5 junior consultants with less than 10 years in the field, 5 consultants with more than 10 years but less than 20, and 3 consultants that had been in the field for more than 20 years. Of the female participants, 2 had never had children and 2 were currently pregnant with their first child. All of the other female participants had children already. So the 3 main themes that developed through the analysis were gender, motherhood, and workplace mistreatment. The field of medicine has been a masculine domain for many centuries. Maternity care was originally a female-only domain until the forceps were invented in the 17th century. This tool privatised and commercialised the knowledge and skills of its use, which was only shared with men, and male midwives were only afforded by the wealthy. Having a male midwife was a sign of wealth and status, and male midwifery evolved into obstetrics as we know it in the current day, where these tools are continuing to be used. Women were excluded from the practice of medicine until as recently as the last century, and even though women are entering the profession in large numbers, it remains a field which is highly biased towards men. Masculine traits are highly valued within the field of obstetrics and gynaecology. For example, many female participants shared experiences and described attitudes towards the need to have balls in order to survive and succeed. Their discussions referred to masculine qualities such as dominance, risk-taking, confidence, and aggression, which were perceived to be desirable in order to perform well in the field. Participants made the following comments, and many more, during interviews, such as, "I just need to grow some balls, probably," referring to wanting to be able to stand up for herself. "Still a big sausage party," referring to the leadership mostly being men. "You have to walk in the door flopping your chop on the bar and say, 'I'm the biggest swinging dick here,' referring to attempting to be heard amongst male colleagues. However, women also reflected that despite masculine qualities being desirable in the field, when women displayed these attributes, they were punished for doing so. Women were considered unlikable if they were assertive and direct in their approach. According to participants, they were damned if they do and damned if they don't. For example, Sarah, a registrar with 3 young children, described these difficulties in the following quote. She likened herself to being a poorly paid prostitute. "I think the midwives and nursing staff tend to fawn over them, men, and take their direction a lot better than they do coming from us. We don't get to lead from that place of just inherent authority. Our authority is earned, and that's quite annoying at times because it's exhausting. I always used to say that I'm the most highly educated and poorly paid prostitute in my hospital, because that's really what it is. You're just prostituting yourself day in and day out, constantly making people laugh and kissing their butts and bringing them around to your way of thought. Like, it's exhausting." The phenomenon of women being considered less likable and thought to have diminished interpersonal skills if they display masculine traits is well described in the literature. This double bind for women creates significant difficulty in deciding how to behave in the workplace in order to be effective in their jobs. If they're considered unlikable, it affects their career opportunities, and if they're considered ineffective, it also affects their career opportunities. Obstetrics and gynaecology favours an ideal worker, and an ideal worker is a full-time employee who is always available and doesn't have external responsibilities outside the workplace. Workers who are able to conform to this model are rewarded, and those who do not are considered less valuable. This further disadvantages women who are disproportionately required to fulfill unpaid caring roles outside of their paid employment, while carrying greater amounts of cognitive and emotional load at work, as well as at home. Female participants discuss the stress, guilt, and at times suffering of trying to fit into a profession where the job is expected to come first. All of the female participants who quit training did so due to family responsibilities. Lily, a mum of 3 young children who was employed on a half-time contract when she quit training, said this about her work commitments. By the time you do 2.5 days a week as a 0.5 FTE, the days will be 10-hour days and a half day plus overtime. It would be at least a 30-hour week and sometimes 40 hours as a part-time. It is still an immensely rewarding career, and I would consider going back if I could work in a capacity where I could maintain a degree of flexibility while delivering appropriate level care. Lily explained that she felt that it was her fault that she was unable to maintain this level of work, not the profession, because she felt that she couldn't commit 100% to the workplace and that's what was needed. However, a normal half-time workload should have been between 18 to 20 hours a week, not 30 or 40. The physical world also presents challenges to women. Surgical instruments are one size fits all and created for the male body. Chloe, a registrar with 3 young children, describes her frustration at not being able to use the instruments how they are designed. Things like laparoscopic equipment. To make me look like a numpty, it's big and it's awkward. I get told by my supervisor to just do this, and I say I have to put the other instrument down to do that. I can't do it all like that. My hands are just not long enough. This means that women who generally have smaller hands and bodies can struggle to use those instruments, and it may take them longer to master the skills required in surgery, and this can be problematic for their confidence and also make them seem less competent than their male colleagues. Despite the significant barriers for women in obstetrics and gynaecology, and the propensity of women to choose careers which are considered family-friendly, women outnumbered men significantly in applying for and entering the field. The motivations between the men and the women that I interviewed in this research were notably different. Many of the women said that they were motivated by feminism, activism, and advocacy. Isabel, a female consultant who had 3 children, says, "I felt a commitment, a drive to become an advocate for women, to empower women in healthcare. The drive behind that was seeing injustices in women's health and trying to improve things for women." A significant number of female participants also said similar things. While there were only 3 men who were interviewed, none of them mentioned being motivated by a desire for advocacy or to improve things from a political perspective. Lawrence, a senior consultant with multiple children, said, and he trained a number of decades ago, "In those days, all the obstetricians were blokes. They were blokes I really liked, and I thought, this is a club I want to join. They were guys who were really fun. They were good-humoured, and I just loved being in their company. I wanted to be part of that club." So it's an unusual phenomenon that women are wanting to join a professional career which is not family-friendly in terms of its work attributes. It seems that for women in the field, these meaningful higher-level motivators overshadow the difficulties that they face. This would potentially suggest that women in leadership positions may also hold different agendas to men in those positions. Despite many female participants entering the profession due to political motivations, there was a fear of the field becoming feminized, which was expressed by a couple of participants. Lawrence said, "If you look at fully feminized professions such as nursing, midwifery, teaching, cleaning, they are all seen as lesser professions. There is not one fully feminized profession which is seen as a match, and that ultimately could have many unintended consequences." There was also a female participant who mentioned that she was concerned about the feminization of the profession due to workforce issues and women working part-time more commonly. Feminized professions are seen to have less prestige and status and earn less money. These attitudes at the highest levels potentially create barriers to addressing the difficulties faced by women as the focus shifts from equity to contesting the feminization of the profession. Linked to the concern about the feminisation of the field, there were indications from participants, both men and women, that female doctors posed a threat to male doctors and were therefore subject to unfavourable treatment and being pushed out of career pathways. Lawrence, a senior male consultant with multiple children, said, "I find it really disappointing, the suggestion that women in some way will be better obstetricians and gynecologists. And I find it disappointing where women start things like all female practices. I think they demean themselves by doing that because they're marketing their gender and they're better than that. And I think they do their male colleagues or potential male colleagues a disservice." A number of women described situations where they felt that they were pushed out due to the fact that they were considered competition by more senior doctors. Male doctors. Scarlett, a female consultant with 2 children, started a private practice in a regional town and was approached by a male colleague. He came and had a long, serious chat with me about how he didn't want a woman in town. I'd bankrupt him, I'd ruin his business, and I should leave. Natalia, a junior female consultant with 3 children who expressed an interest in a field her male supervisor practiced in, so a subspecialty, found that her supervisor then tried to prevent her from progressing. "He was my supervisor for a few years. He tried to foul my terms. He said I was a crap surgeon and I shouldn't do any surgery. But then I went to another hospital and people say that you're amazing and you're a great surgeon." William, a junior male consultant with 4 children who works in a large hospital, says of his hospital, "Over the last 6, 7, 8 years, we've failed to provide a pathway for highly capable, competent, committed, excellent senior female trainees who would have wanted to stay. We have the sort of nepotistic culture where the random boy is coming through who miraculously have this whole pathway set up for them." He goes on to say that it's associated with male clinicians who feel like they're threatened by female obstetricians who tend to have an easier time attracting patients. From my data, it seems as though more assistance is afforded to male participants and males in the field than females in terms of career progression opportunities, and women are subject to being pushed out due to the fact that they pose a threat. In summary, women are moving into the field of obstetrics and gynaecology in overwhelming numbers, despite the profession remaining a man's world, where having balls, being the ideal worker, and masculine traits are valued. This leaves women disadvantaged and struggling to achieve the same levels of success within the profession. Despite the deterrence, women are attracted to obstetrics and gynaecology due to the meaningful nature of the work, where the personal is political. Women who thrive in the work environment often have to behave like men in order to do so. Even though the motivation for women entering the profession often reflects their values, including advocacy for and the promotion of equity for women, there are some people, especially men, who fear the feminisation of the profession. Men are declining in numbers and are being threatened by the changing work environment. There is resistance to the adjustments within the profession, and the resistance is leading to some poor treatment of women in the field. Much of gender inequity is subtle and invisible, and therefore passes as women not being suitable for the field, as evidenced by women quitting. One of the most important points of gender is reproduction, which I'll discuss in the next section. The theme of women's reproductive bodies and motherhood encompasses all stages from reproductive potential of women who haven't yet had children, through to pregnancy, maternity leave, returning to work, breastfeeding, and raising children. Universally, women in this research experience significant workplace disadvantage associated with these issues throughout their careers. While there were only 3 men interviewed in the study, therefore this can't be extrapolated to every man in the field, none of the male participants found that their children had been a barrier to their career progression. They all had between 4 and 5 children each, and all acknowledged the role of women in their lives who were the primary carers for those children and allowed them to keep allowed them to continue their work unencumbered. William, a junior consultant with 4 children, summed it up by saying of his responsibilities at home, "I think what evolved is that the house runs without me, and when I can contribute, what I can contribute, that is appreciated and good. I'm probably not able to be relied on for much at all, and things just work under the expectation that I won't actually be there." For the 3 men that participated in this research, there was a similar story. This was not the case for any of the women, even the women who had stay-at-home partners. Most women who are junior doctors or in training stages of their careers are also in their reproductive years. Women generally don't complete O&G training, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, until they're in their mid-30s, by which time fertility has significantly declined. Therefore, many women choose to have children prior to completion of their training. Having babies in training is considered a huge inconvenience to the workplace due to the nature of training, including shift work, limited staff available, high workload, high overtime requirements. Any person who needs adjustment to the roster is considered an inconvenience, and often workload of other trainees will have to increase in order to compensate. This fosters a negative attitude towards women having babies. The system is not designed to allow for flexibility. Tegan, a consultant with 1 child, said prior to going on her rural rotation, and this is a quote, "The head of our labour ward had a meeting with everyone. I remember him casually saying, 'You all need to get a Mirena IUD.' He wasn't joking. He's like, 'I don't want any of you to come back pregnant because it just makes life really hard.'" A Mirena is an intrauterine contraceptive device that lasts for 5 years. In 2016, Ranscog was planning a debate at an Australian scientific meeting titled "Membership Before Maternity Leave. Should every registrar have a Mirena?" This proposed debate made it to mainstream media headlines because it questions the reproductive rights of female O&G trainees. Ranscog said that it was supposed to be tongue-in-cheek, but all of the participants I spoke to about it and who mentioned it in interviews found it really upsetting as it hit close to home with attitudes that are expressed within the workplace commonly. Olive, a female registrar who was pregnant with her first child, said, "I know of people who have fallen pregnant in their core training and considered terminating because of those attitudes." Many participants said that they were faced with similar statements from senior colleagues throughout their training. Not only did women find it difficult when they were pregnant, but they also found it difficult because of their reproductive potential. A number of trainees divulged that they were questioned about their reproductive plans, either in interviews or in recruitment sessions. And one of the male participants said that it was a common discussion point prior to employing candidates. He was regularly asked by the people making decisions about employment if he knew who was pregnant or planning pregnancy. Due to the pressure to not have children during training, a number of female participants said that in interviews they told the panel that they were currently using an implanon or a Mirena for contraception in order to reassure them that they wouldn't pose a threat of taking maternity leave. Tegan, a female junior consultant with 1 child, admitted that in an interview for a registrar position, she said, "Don't worry, I'm not going to take any time off to have maternity leave," because she felt that it would give her an edge over the other women who were also applying for the job. Catherine, a female junior consultant with 1 child, said that at the Ranscog meeting recently in Adelaide, there were several people talking about similar questions being asked of them during recruiting, which all implied that the person asking the question wanted to know about their intentions to have children. Despite the pressure to avoid having children, many trainees have children during their training time. Delaying family until after training could have devastating consequences due to a decline in fertility at that age. There's a lot of stigma and disapproval of having babies during training, as evidenced by the past 2 slides. Once pregnant, many participants expressed their fear of letting their department know that they were expecting because of the backlash that they might face due to their pregnancy. Scarlett, a female consultant, experienced a miscarriage requiring a procedure. After she returned to work, she was told by a senior male colleague regarding her miscarriage of her wanted pregnancy, "Oh well, it was probably for the best, because it would have ruined your career." Sandra, a trainee with one child, hid her pregnancy until she was 25 weeks pregnant because she was worried about not being employed. When I was pregnant with my second child and I had applied for a job in the O&G department, I chose to not disclose my pregnancy to anybody at work because I knew that if it was known that I was pregnant, I wouldn't get a job. Natalia, a female junior consultant with 3 children, says that she gave birth at hospital when she was on a regular night shift and her consultant refused to come in and relieve her. I actually gave birth at work on a night shift. I was 36 weeks and come in for a normal shift and went into labour. While I was in labour, there was no way they could manage the labour ward anymore. The consultant on call was not interested in coming in and helping out. The lack of support for pregnant trainees was very evident throughout the interviews. Connected to the problem of pregnancy for women are the structural issues of taking leave to have a baby and returning to work after maternity leave. It is well known that leave for caring responsibilities disadvantages workers across all professional fields, and medicine is no exception. Maternity leave posed a number of problems for participants. Due to the nature of training and moving between hospitals, some women found that they weren't eligible for maternity leave because they hadn't worked in their current location for more than a year. Issues also arose for some participants who took a break from their training and then had to repeat training that they'd already completed. And one participant mentioned that she was told by her colleagues on returning from maternity leave that she had to cover all the after hours on call to make up for the holiday that she'd just been on. Many women had issues returning to work while breastfeeding. Most were unable to balance lactation breaks with work, and the workplace was not particularly helpful. Most women decided to either extend their maternity leave so that they could continue breastfeeding or cease breastfeeding so that they could return to work. Lawrence, a senior male consultant, said of lactation breaks and the difficulty with finding them, "You run a labour ward 24 hours a day, every day. So therefore, you have a registrar who wants to take a lactation break. Okay, that's fine. You write the timetable for me and you can have the lactation break." He had minimal sympathy for the issue due to what seemed like an insurmountable rostering problem. The lack of breastfeeding breaks also led to women developing mastitis. Sandra, a female trainee with 2 children, said that she can't remember how many times she had mastitis, and occasionally when she was very unwell, or one of the other registrars was very unwell with mastitis, they would cannulate each other and administer IV flucloxacillin, which is the antibiotic that we treat mastitis with, in order to continue working while sick. We had raging mastitis, and there was this expectation that you just keep going. It's only now that I look back on it and I think that's really unacceptable. It's so inappropriate. In what other field would that be, that expectation? Participants also faced the same sorts of issues when their children were sick and they needed to take carers leave. This was frowned upon. There is significant disadvantage associated with maternity for all women, regardless of whether they had children or not. These experiences paint a fairly grim picture of how women in obstetrics and gynaecology are treated by their employing hospitals and training organisations. The final theme of my research is workplace mistreatment. Workplace mistreatment is an umbrella term which is used to refer to all types of professional misconduct occurring within the workplace. In the medical profession, this behaviour is commonplace, and the types of workplace mistreatment that I'll talk about include sexual harassment, bullying, and discrimination. In 2022, RANZCOG commissioned a large survey to determine the prevalence, extent, and nature of workplace mistreatment within the field. It was a large survey of 2,105 respondents, of which 62% said that they'd been subject to mistreatment in the form of bullying, sexual harassment, or discrimination. The report states, RANZCOG trainees purport the highest prevalence of bullying and sexual harassment when compared to other membership groups, which is an indication that these behaviours are more of a problem in O&G than in other areas of medicine. The report also states that women have significantly higher prevalence ratings for these behaviours at 70.2% compared to men at 47.5%, and almost 6 times the sexual harassment rating at 19.3% versus 3.4%. Based on this data, workplace mistreatment is undeniably a serious problem within the field of ONG in Australia, and it is also an issue which disproportionately disadvantages women. This quantitative data complements the qualitative data which I've collected on individual experiences of workplace mistreatment in the field and highlights the fact that these issues are significant and pervasive. Sexual harassment encompasses a wide range of sexual behaviours which are unwanted or unwelcome. These behaviours are unlawful and can lead to mental health issues, job dissatisfaction, and decrease in work performance. It may be reasonably expected that the field of obstetrics and gynaecology would be fully aware of the gender issues and sensitive to the damage caused by sexual harassment and assault. However, within that report that I mentioned earlier, 13.5% of respondents had experienced sexual harassment at work. Of these instances, 53.4% reported that they'd been the recipient of inappropriate physical contact, 5% reported they'd been sexually assaulted, and 0.8% reported that they'd been raped in the workplace by a professional colleague. Many participants shared their experience of sexual harassment in the field. These experiences ranged from sexually explicit comments or offensive jokes to inappropriate touching. Perpetrators of sexual harassment were often well known and regularly behaved poorly towards multiple doctors, and often this was witnessed by other staff members. In 2015, Dr. Gabrielle McMullen, a prominent vascular surgeon, publicly claimed that women in the medical profession should comply with requests for sex from male superiors to further their careers. She wasn't condoning the culture which allows this to occur, but pointing out the reality of how people who make complaints are treated within medicine. She says, if you complain, you'll be exposed, you'll be hung up to dry, and you won't be able to work. You absolutely would be seen as a liability moving forwards. Lily, a female registrar who quit training and had 3 young children, gave an account of working with a consultant who was well known for inappropriate behaviour. She said, the registrars before me had trouble as well and reported back. However, nothing was done about his behaviour. For laparoscopic surgery, instead of standing on the other side of the table to assist you, he would stand behind you with his arms around you, which he would not do for the male trainees. I reported it to an obstetrician and another independent medical examiner, and nothing was done about it. He was my training supervisor. He was the supervisor who would sign my forms, and I just wanted to pass the term and leave. And when all the female trainees who went one after the other, we all knew when it came to signing our forms, you had to go to his rooms across the road and make sure the door was left open, and to just get in and get out. She also mentioned that everybody could see what was happening. This was happening in the operating theatre. And the reason that she gave for him being allowed to get away with it is because he made the hospital a lot of money. The organisation knew what was going on. This misbehaviour had previously been reported, and witnesses could clearly see what was happening. By not acting, the behaviour is condoned by the organisation. The difficulties with reporting and following through on preventing sexual harassment is also highlighted by Lawrence's attitude towards inappropriate behaviour. He said, I've been told about 2 doctors I work with who touch women inappropriately. And when I question the women, they just say, oh, that's just X, and that's what he does. And I'm really conflicted because I can't go to battle on this unless they battle. He also mentioned another time when he heard a male doctor telling a sexist joke. He went up to the man and said, I know we've only just met, but you're the most offensive human being I've ever met. Further in our interview, he went on to say, but anyway, he and I became good mates after that. It's hardly surprising that it's difficult for victims of sexual harassment and assault to speak out about their experiences when the most senior people within the field are unable to do anything about it. Most participants experienced or witnessed bullying at some stage in their careers. Women experience bullying more than men, and men are responsible for more bullying behaviours than women. The prevalence statistic for bullying found within the recent report commissioned by RANZCOG showed that 44.3% of respondents had been subject to bullying. A couple of participants mentioned that there were occasions where they felt physically threatened at work. It often occurred in public, and it was generally inflicted by senior staff towards those more junior. These incidents resulted in significant distress and humiliation. Alexander, a junior consultant with multiple children, says that the types of bullying he was aware of in the workplace included verbally aggressive behaviour, threats of physical violence, and, rape-like statements to people who were asking for roster changes, from a male senior registrar to a group of junior female registrars. Mary, a registrar with one child who quit training, said that she experienced the following bullying: verbal, with some physicality to some of the bullying as well. For example, body language, posturing, approaching people in corridors when they're alone, and again using gender to exert power. While bullying can be considered largely a non-gendered phenomenon because it can be directed towards men and women both, it is known to disproportionately be directed towards women within the field of obstetrics and gynaecology. In his article on workplace bullying as a gendered phenomenon, Salem says, social dominance theory holds that the dominant group or groups maintain their power in part by using various forms of oppression against less fortunate groups. It has been argued that women's progress at work constitutes a threat to the status quo of male dominance and female subordination. The victimisation of women can then be explained as a form of social control. Many female participants said that they experienced discrimination in the course of their careers, which was often related to their role as being mothers and women, which I've discussed in the previous section, so I won't go on about here. There are two types of discrimination, direct and indirect. Direct discrimination occurs when somebody is treated unfavourably because of a protected attribute, such as gender, sexuality, race, religion, pregnancy, etc. And indirect discrimination occurs when a group of people with a protected attribute are disproportionately disadvantaged by a certain requirement or rule. The rules that seem to cause most difficulty for participants pertain to the requirement for continuous and full-time employment during the first year of training. While this rule applies to everyone, men and women, it disproportionately affected women having babies. This was also the case for a number of other training rules, which were harder for women to comply with than men and saw women disadvantaged more frequently. Another cause of discrimination that was mentioned by participants was race and ethnicity. The scope of this thesis was to explore the barriers associated with gender, so I didn't ask any specific questions about this. Despite this, though, a number of participants did mention racism. Many participants commented that they'd witnessed it or experienced it themselves, and this included towards patients and also towards other doctors. Sally, a woman with one child who quit training, says, "I've seen institutional racism towards Indigenous people in terms of the treatment they received." Violet, a female registrar who was born and raised in Southeast Asia and has one child, says, "You have to assimilate. I had to prove over and over who I am and where I am now. It's not easy." People who suffer multiple forms of discrimination often find that these inequalities compound one another and are more than just the sum of the individual forms of discrimination. While this research did not explore racism in depth, it does show that racism is an issue within the field, and there is significant evidence on the topic to hypothesize that racism within the field affects women disproportionately compared to men. The curriculum of bullying begins in medical school, with most medical students experiencing or witnessing workplace mistreatment before they even qualify as doctors. There is so much competition for training positions and reliance on senior doctors for referee reports for those positions, as well as the cultural hierarchy in medicine, which leaves junior doctors vulnerable to workplace mistreatment by the power imbalances that exist. There is also significant risk related to reporting mistreatment, so often it's ignored and overlooked as a coping mechanism. People who had been exposed to their behaviours over long periods of time become desensitised and may not realise that it's occurring. Josephine, a junior consultant with one child, at the beginning of the interview, denied that she'd ever been subject to any of those behaviours. Knowing the topic of my research, she started quite strongly to defend her training hospital where she's currently employed as a consultant. She said, "I was well supported throughout my training. I never felt that I was disadvantaged being a female trainee in a very male predominant department at that stage, and certainly didn't feel discriminated against." Later in the interview, when I questioned about whether she'd seen any bullying, she told me that the junior doctors in the department are currently putting in a formal complaint about bullying. I questioned the discrepancy between her initially claiming that the department was very supportive and the perspective of those junior doctors. And she said, "I think it's because I've been there a long time. He's done that to me in the past as well," referring to the person that they were complaining about, "when I was a trainee. For me, I think going through training, I felt either turn a blind eye or pretend that you didn't see certain things in order to not just survive, but also to enjoy it as much as you can. I just can't take everything seriously." Normalisation of mistreatment within the workplace was a common reaction of participants, and it allowed them to survive. Bystanders are people who don't experience the workplace mistreatment themselves, but they either witness it or hear about it subsequently. Workplace mistreatment has significant negative effects on bystanders as well as towards those who experience the mistreatment firsthand. McDonald's report on behalf of the Human Rights Commission found that studies have shown that women working in an environment that is hostile to women and lax about harassment can experience similar negative impacts to those women who are actual targets of sexual harassment. This means that almost all of the women working in the field are adversely affected by the fact that the field continues to allow oppression of women by way of workplace mistreatment. So the limitations of my study: as an in-depth qualitative project, the aim of data collection was not population representativeness, but the exploration of the experiences of a small number of people working in the field. Another limitation is the narrow scope and binary definition of gender that I used, men and women. This may contribute to the exclusion of non-binary and transgender people. There's also a lack of exploration around other forms of disadvantage within the field, including race, sexuality, gender diversity, physical ability, and many more. I also want to acknowledge the lack of First Nations voices within this research. While Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island mothers and babies have the poorest maternity outcomes in Australia and represent 5% of the babies born in Australia, there is a serious lack of representation in the medical field, and only 0.2% of ONG doctors identify as First Nations people. The disadvantage women face from the combination of societal gender norms, their reproductive bodies and mothering, as well as the increased likelihood to experience workplace mistreatment, represent significant barriers to career progression. These forms of disadvantage are overlapping and concurrent. The effect that gender, motherhood, and mistreatment has on career barriers can be seen in this pictorial. Women who face these forms of oppression experience them as cumulative, multi-layered, and complicated with feedback loops. For example, female gender comes with inherent disadvantages in the workplace, but it also increases the risk of being bullied, discriminated against, and of being sexually harassed. Motherhood has the greatest negative impact on participants by decreasing their ability to fulfill the ideal worker mold, thereby increasing the gender disadvantage and also having an increased likelihood of workplace mistreatment. This is in stark contrast to the experiences men have described in this research when they become fathers. In order to improve equity for women in the field, there needs to be significant change which addresses these barriers on a societal, organisational, and individual level. In conclusion, the structural pressures faced by women in the field of ONG are cumulative. The medical workplace has been built on a patriarchal foundation with a high value placed on men and masculinity. Women suffer oppression within the workplace due to gender norms, motherhood, and mistreatment. The workplace has changed to include many more women, and yet the workplace is still a masculine domain. Contemporary life strives for productivity and profit, and women are disadvantaged as they carry out the majority of domestic and unpaid work, which is undervalued within society. Women are required to attend to masculinity in the workplace in order to be taken seriously, yet they're also punished for displaying assertive and competitive traits, which are expected of a leader. Women are also more likely to be victims of mistreatment and adverse behaviour from colleagues in the workplace, and this increases with having children. It is a triple whammy of disadvantage: female gender, workplace mistreatment, and mothering, or balls, babies, and bullying. These things are mutually compounding, not just additive. Motherhood in particular makes women more vulnerable, detracts from the ideal worker status, and undercuts their feelings of competency in the workplace. This all adds up to the current situation where there are large numbers of women in training, but it remains difficult for them to achieve positions of leadership. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melanie. That was fantastic. Very, very interesting. I'm just going to go ahead and stop. I'll leave that up, but I just want to make sure we can see the chat so that as I go around asking questions, if anything pops up here, if you just monitor that, that'd be great. We have about 8 minutes for questions. So if anybody has any, please raise your hands. I'll come around. And if you're online, you can feel free to pop your question in the chat or try and ask it as well.
Thanks, Melanie. That was really interesting. It's quite difficult to formulate a question when I'm furious. And I just to think kind of more broadly. So you reported that ONG has the worst rates of bullying and gender-based bullying. I wonder if that's just because that's the makeup of the workforce, so it's a highly feminized workforce, or is it actually something cultural about ONG?
It's hard to know, but that would be a really good topic to have a look at. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you very much. It was really a great presentation. And I'm dismayed that I had the same experience 20 plus years ago in my clinical times. And it was not ONG, but it was ophthalmology. So I think it's quite generalizable, unfortunately. The question is whether there were any changes happening over time. Can we see any change?
Yeah.
And how can we sort of push? Because we have ideas and we are really angry about it and whatever, but it looks like, as you said, it's normalized. Or how can we start it in the medical school? And you mentioned about medical school that students sometimes see it already. It's normalized.
That's a really good question. And I think that certainly within RANZCOG, there is work that's being done. And they've put out recent reports as of last year looking at promoting women into positions of leadership. And all of that's fantastic work. And the next RANZCOG president that's coming in later in the year is a woman. So that's fantastic. But I guess some of the things that they need to address, the cultural issues that allow some women to succeed, but probably a lot of women are still not able to. And so even though you have lots of women, we're just not seeing them go up to those levels. We're not seeing, and so even if you have half of the women in leadership, half of the people in leadership are women, that's not representative of 83% or 80% trainee cohort, or 99. I don't know how many women we look after as patients.
Just to follow up on that, out of curiosity, has there been a female president of RANZ?
There has been, so before there was RANZCOG, there was one female president a long time ago. Since RANZCOG was formed in the 1980s, there's been one president since, and there's about to be one coming up.
Sounds like it's time for more. And do you have any suggestions or follow-up planning that you're doing in relation to this? Maybe even in this sense of like a policy brief or something, that practical solutions that
so I guess that's probably a little bit beyond what I was looking at, but certainly ways of doing training where we're not expecting people to work 100 hours a week in order to gain the skills and exposure that they need to clinical issues. So and there's lots of simulation type training and different ways of learning, and perhaps we could look at ways that university could be involved in training instead of having supervisors involved in training and the ones that sign you off to say that you're competent or not when then you're going into competition with them later on down the track.
We've got one in the chat, you're just gonna open that. Oh, it's like a comment.
That's true, yes, thanks, Jess. So in the last few years, there was a rule that RANZCOG had that you must complete your first year full-time continuously. So that meant if you took any unplanned leave in your first year of training, you had to start first year again. And they have removed that as a training requirement. So too late for me, yeah. So removal of training requirement to complete first year continuous full-time was positive, too late for many though, absolutely. Would you like to comment on the experience of motions for start collections? So I didn't go into, I didn't ask people about sexuality, and so I can't really comment on the experiences of LGBTQI women. So sorry about that, unless anyone has anything that they could add to that. Emotional responses to data collection. Yeah, it was interesting. So some people came into the interviews, like when I talked about normalization, some people came into the interviews with, well, I've never experienced any discrimination, and then as we talked, and I said, well, what about this thing that you said happened to you? And they're like, oh, okay. Yeah, you're right. That's like, so people realized that they had experienced discrimination, some people. Other people came into the interviews already quite aware of what had happened to them throughout their training. And a lot of people really just wanted to get it off their chest, I think, and talk about it. And people, like I found in terms of recruiting, I recruited very quickly, very easily. People really wanted to be a part of this research. And I feel like I can't do everybody justice with the rich data that they gave me, and I'm really grateful for the things that they told me. So yeah.
And Mel, I think Chris is maybe also interested in your own righteous anger, so reflections on, you know, your process of dealing with data that's very complex and personal connection for you.
Yeah, so I think I've struggled with that, absolutely. And as I mentioned in my statement on reflexiveness, I really had to make sure that my experiences weren't the ones that were privileged, but the experiences of participants were, because it would be very easy to just put a little bit of my experience in there as well, because I've certainly struggled with a lot of these issues.
I was thinking in response to that, I mean, and I'm guessing, I'm sorry, I'm thinking in response to that, and I'm probably guessing here, but it seems to me that the process of writing it and reflecting on it as a PhD is a sort of a process almost of smoothing out some of those highs and lows, and so it's probably doesn't occur so much when you're collecting the data, but it's this period, you know, 6 months, a year later, when you're writing and reflecting on it. And I think you know, and that will be apparent in the thesis. That's my guess. Anyway.
And also just going back to interviews and rereading data when I'm writing, going, I just can't believe that this happened. And the funny thing is, and people that work in medicine probably know, that when you talk to people outside of medicine, they just can't believe what goes on. Like, it is unbelievable. And yet us within the field are like, oh, that's what happens every day.
Time for one last question.
Yeah, I think we can just do this last one.
Have you had any contact with or comment from RANZCOG leadership about this research? Not yet, Jess.
Excellent. Melanie, thank you so much. Everybody, give Melanie one more round of applause.
And I'll just go ahead and close. We will continue with in-person seminars again for the rest of this semester. Next week, we have Drs. John Nolviana from the Australian National Centre for the Public Awareness of Science and our own Associate Professor Hannah Olson, who will join us in the Peterbond building to share their recent work. For those of you on campus with us today, please feel free to join us for some biscuits out in the lobby and coffee as well. And thanks everybody who also joined online. See you next week.
Awesome.